So now this finishes the basic part of what React Router is, what client-side routing is, how we can change the routes, and how we can show different components. For example, when you had homeworks, you could just say homework exercise 1, homework exercise 2, homework exercise 3, and in each of them, exercise 1, exercise 2, exercise 3, for example, this could be a counter component, this could be your um, anything else, or whatever apps we made, the image rotator app or anything else, these all components could be rendered separately and we can give links to navigate through each of them. The next part of this week, we're gonna look into more interesting parts of React Router and also combine it with use context and see what use context also does. For the next part, I want to show how we can pass some data from the URL itself. Sometimes you have seen routes like, for example, if I go here and let's say I have a route called user and user/1, let's say, or user/2. And we want to receive this ID from the user so that we can maybe make a fetch request and get some data for this user ID number 2, anything like that, and just display it around. So let me start making something like that. Let's say I have a users page. So const users. And this is just a users page. Let's call it users page. And it will return me a paragraph tag. My keyboard shortcuts are definitely not working today, which is pretty annoying, but let's continue. And I can make a paragraph tag. I'm gonna actually make a couple of them. And I'm gonna say name is some name. City is some city. And let's just put age. I don't know what I'm doing here, but age. And let's have these three variables as well. Const name is equal to, I'll just put my name. Name is students. Const city is equal to Amsterdam. And const age is equal to 27, right? If I go on, let's say /user, I want to have this. So let me just put another route. I'm going to put it after contact. And it'll be this users route. And it'll be /user, let's say. Let's see what this since we were at user/2 and that matches the sub route of user, we're already seeing my name and everything. So this is good. I went to the user/2, and even though we just specified the route as user here, since user/2 is a sub route of this route, our switch basically matches it to exactly this and renders it out, which is also helpful for us. But let's say instead of this, we had some user data. So let's say const users, and this was a list of users we had. And I can make like the first user to be me. So I'm just going to put my name. I'm going to put my city. And I'm going to put my age as well. Right, and I'm also going to give myself an ID because probably if this data is coming from, let's say, the database via some network request, we always have IDs to identify different things. I'm going to make another user. I'm going to give the user ID 2. Let's say the name is Joe. City is New York. Age is 32, right? We have these two users, and somehow in this user/2, I want to show the user ID 2, and let's say if I'm at user/1, I want to show details of me, my name, my city, my state, my age, and if I go on user/2, I want to show the user details of the of the other user in the system. So how can I do that? And let's say if none of these match, then we go to this home page if the user's ID don't match. So somehow I need here something as user ID, and I don't know how to get that as a prop. If I have that user ID as a prop, then I can simply go const user is equal to users dot find. And from a single user, we want to find where user dot ID is triple equal to the user ID that we are getting from the route. And if we have that user, then I can just go say user.name, user.city, and user.age. So how do I get this user ID? If we go on React's documentation and look at query parameters, I think it should be there. Oh, this is telling us just query parameters, recursive, auth links, custom links, URL parameters. Sorry, not query parameters, but URL parameters is what we were looking for. The URL parameter says that I can have this tag as like .id. And if I pass that route as another children, it should automatically get there. So if I now see the child route, I can use something called use params and get that ID out. So let's try to do this. I am going to put here as another route because our user has actually one more thing. It has something called user ID to it, right? And how can I get the user ID? Well, I'm passing it as a parameter, right? It's a URL parameter. After the user, there's something /2. And I'm saying that that's a user ID. That's a variable. Attach the variable, whatever is it coming. It could be 0, it could be 1, it could be 2, and so on. Give it a variable called user ID in the URL parameters. Now, in this, I want to access it. So it's not coming for me in the props, but I have something called use params. Let me see if I've imported it. No, I haven't. I'm going to just import it called use params. And use params will give me all the parameters that the URL currently has. So I'm going to put here const, I don't know, something. Let's say my user ID is equal to use params. And since use param is giving me every sort of a parameter, I just want to have the user ID parameter out of it. The URL could have many other parameters, but we are only interested in the user ID parameter. Let me just try to see what the documentation says. The use parameter, yes, will give me an object which will have all the parameters, and I can just take the parameter out. Why would this not be working? Because user.find, if I get a user, user.id, that should be matching the user ID. Okay, this is something interesting. If I go and log the user ID, this is tricky. This is going to be tricky. I'm going to help you out. If I start looking at my console when this page reads, I'm getting this 2 as this user ID. So if I put this as an object again, we can see it better. This is a tip for debugging. Put your variable names as objects so that you can see them. I'll show you what I mean. So I get this object which says user ID is 2. But notice it is here showing that user ID is 2, but a string of 2. And that's why when we were trying to triple match it, we cannot find any user with an ID which has 2 as a string. What I can do here, I can say to string on this, which means find any user that has an ID which when converted to a string is same as this user ID 2. And look now, since I went on user/2, the user ID was 2 as a string. So this was, just as a reminder, this was 2 as a string. We tried to find from the users array any user that has an ID. These IDs are numbers 1 and 2. Convert that number to a string. Why we are trying to convert the number to a string? Because the user ID that from the parameter we are getting is a string. Because this user ID could be something like user1 or something like that. So this is always string. The router doesn't know that this is a number per se. It is part of the URL, which is already a string. So this user ID comes as 2 as a string, and we are saying try to match any users which have an ID, and when that ID is converted to string, it should be equal to the same user ID that's coming from the parameters. We are only converting here to string because from the parameters we always get string. One another way, let's just say that if it works first. So if I go on user/1, that should be having my data and it should show my name. Perfect. If I go on user/2, I'm reading the ID 2 from the parameters, which is a string. I'm trying to find a user whose ID, when converted to a string, matches the same as the ID coming from the parameter. But I could also go and say here as parse int. Actually, I could go and say oh wow, my machine is crying literally at this point. I can say parse int of user ID on base 10, and there's one more bracket necessary.
I found this on the web.
Oh, Siri just popped in. Anyway, now it's what it's doing. It's trying to get the user ID. It's trying to get the integer out of the user ID. It is a string. From the string, we are trying to find the integer. And if we find that integer, and this 10 is sort of important, it means that find the integers on base 10. The base could be anything, but by default, it's safe to always put 10 here. And now when we find that integer, which when converted from an ID to ID which was a string of 2, this will be an integer 2, and that can be easily found in our users array, and hence we are able to see it again. So I would say do anything, either do a parse int or do user ID to string. I would say do parse int and first check that are you getting a number or not, because somebody might just put a really wrong URL here and then it'll try to parse int and fail upon it. But let's say, we would keep it to 2, and we are able to hit that route and get it from the use params. So here we could see how we could pass some data around in the URL and as well as read that data from the URL and do some sort of thing. Currently, I'm just doing a users.find, but imagine this is a fetch request where you send the user ID and you get all the data of the user, and then you're just showing the user.name. The same, everything will work around same. Instead, I'm having sort of like a database in my own front end rather than going to a backend, making an API and trying to fetch data from there. So this is how we can pass some data around in the URL and also retrieve it and render our component according to the data we get from our URL.